In the autumn of 539 BC, the Empire of Babylon was the center of the known world, a city that seemed immune to time itself. Its walls were so wide that 4 chariots could ride abreast along their tops. Its gates were sealed in bronze and iron. Its palaces rose over the Euphrates River like fortresses built on reflections. For centuries, Babylon had endured wars, rebellions, and sieges without falling. It was more than a capital, it was a statement of permanence. To take it by force was considered impossible. But far to the east, another empire had risen, younger, hungrier, and ruled by a man who refused to believe in the idea of impossible. Cyrus II of Persia had conquered the Medes and the Lydians in less than a decade. Now, all that remained between him and the western edge of the known world was Babylon. To him, the city was not just a conquest, it was a test of vision. To rule Asia, he needed not only land but legitimacy. Babylon was the key. Whoever held it ruled civilization itself. Politically, the city was vulnerable even if its walls were not. King Nabonidus, the last ruler of Babylon, had alienated both his nobles and his priests. Obsessed with his own religious reforms, he had elevated the moon god Sin above Marduk, Babylon's traditional protector. The priesthood saw it as heresy. The population saw it as arrogance. When the Persians marched west, many Babylonian provinces offered little resistance. They no longer fought for their king, only for the city that symbolized their pride. Cyrus knew this. His scouts and diplomats had already mapped not only the geography of the empire, but its divisions. Still, Babylon itself remained untouchable. Its outer walls stretched more than 10 miles on each side, reinforced by double moats and inner bastions. The Euphrates cut straight through the city, entering under fortified gates and splitting Babylon into northern and southern halves. The river was its supply line, its defense, and its soul. Any army approaching the walls could be drowned or starved. The Babylonians believed that even the gods would find it difficult to take their city. The Persian army reached the plain north of Babylon in early October. What they saw would have broken the confidence of lesser men. Towers gleaming in the sun, banners fluttering in the distance, and walls that seemed to merge with the horizon. No army had ever breached them. No siege engine could approach without being spotted from miles away. The defenders had enough grain to last years, and a constant flow of water. The very thing that kept the city alive, the Euphrates, also made it unassailable. The Persians did not attack. Instead, they encircled the outer districts and cut the land routes. The fields outside the walls were abandoned, their canals dry. For 2 weeks, the armies faced each other across the plain, the Babylonians behind their walls, confident that time would starve the enemy long before it harmed them. Inside, the markets stayed open, priests carried on the daily sacrifices, and the temples of Marduk continued their rituals as if the siege were a distant rumor. Cyrus, however, understood that no fortress is eternal. Not the strongest wall, not the largest gate, not even the faith of its people. He ordered his engineers to study the flow of the Euphrates. In the north, a few miles beyond the outer fortifications, the river widened into a flat plain where an ancient canal once ran, a half-forgotten irrigation basin from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Its dry bed extended westward for nearly a mile, a shallow depression overgrown with reeds. It gave Cyrus an idea that was simple in concept but immense in scale. He would not storm Babylon. He would drain it. Cyrus's general, Gobryas, a defector from Babylon's own ranks, confirmed that the city's lower gates, the ones where the river passed under the walls, were rarely guarded at night. The Babylonians trusted their god and their river more than their soldiers. That arrogance, he said, could be turned into a weapon. By day, Cyrus's men performed the rituals of a siege, building earthworks, moving engines, raising banners. But by night, in silence, laborers and soldiers began to dig. They followed the old canal bed, deepening and widening it to divert the Euphrates into the surrounding basin. The work continued for days under torchlight, invisible from the city's towers. Thousands of hands carved a new path for a river that had not changed its course in 1,000 years. The Babylonians saw the Persian fires flicker in the distance and mistook them for encampments. They did not know that each light marked another section of the canal being completed. When scouts reported that the Persians were fortifying their northern positions, Nabonidus's officers laughed, believing the enemy was preparing to retreat for the coming floods. The river itself became the battlefield. The Euphrates was both barrier and trap. If it could be turned, even briefly, the great walls that depended on it would become exposed. Cyrus's plan relied on precision. The Euphrates flowed swiftly, its level changing with the moon. If the water dropped too slowly, the Persians would be seen and slaughtered in the shallows. If it dropped too fast, the mud would trap them. Success depended on perfect timing, and on the arrogance of Babylon remaining intact until the final moment. By late October, the preparations were complete. The diversion channel stretched for more than 2 miles, its banks reinforced with timber and reeds. Watchtowers along the plain reported that the Babylonians had grown careless, their soldiers relaxing, their gates open to merchants and priests. Cyrus waited for the festival of Tammuz, when the city would be most distracted. A night of music, processions, and offerings to the gods of renewal. On that night, Babylon would be loud, its people drunk, its watchmen few. When the signal came, it would not be a trumpet or drum. It would be the silence of the river. The decision to move was made in the final hours before midnight. Cyrus stood with his generals near the riverbank. The air was dry, and the moon cast no reflection on the slow-moving current. In the distance, the faint glow of Babylon lit the horizon, a floating band of orange and gold above the black plain. At the general's signal, the last barrier in the diversion channel was broken. The first rush of water poured into the empty basin, a whisper that grew into a deep, steady murmur. The Euphrates hesitated, then began to fall. Within an hour, the current inside Babylon dropped by several feet. The river that had sustained the city for centuries was leaving it, and the gates that once looked down on life now stared into emptiness. The soldiers waiting along the banks began to move. They entered the shallows, following the dark, exposed line of the river's bed toward the city walls. Above them, Babylon celebrated music, torches, laughter. No one looked down. The river had begun to change sides. The Persians entered the shallows in silence. The cold mud clung to their legs as they moved single file along the darkened riverbed. They carried their weapons high, each step guided by the faint shimmer of the water that still trickled through the stones. Overhead, the sound of music drifted down from the city. Flutes, drums, and the echo of voices raised in celebration. Babylon believed itself untouched, even as its lifeline was being drained away beneath its walls. The operation depended on coordination more than courage. 2 detachments, advancing from opposite directions, were to meet at the heart of the city where the river widened under the central bridge. The northern force, led by Gobryas, followed the current downstream. The southern unit, commanded by Ugbaru, a Median general in Persian service, advanced upstream toward them. Both columns carried ropes, ladders, and chisels, tools, not banners. The order was clear: no noise, no torches, no hesitation. The first obstacle appeared less than a mile inside the city limits. A series of bronze grates set into the stone foundations of the walls. They had been designed to prevent infiltration by swimmers or boats. Now, half exposed by the receding water, their bolts gleamed faintly. Divers worked by touch, forcing chisels into the corroded joints. Metal gave way with a dull groan. The bars fell outward, vanishing into the mud. The soldiers pressed forward. Above them, the foundations of Babylon towered like cliffs. The walls rose almost 100 feet from the river's edge. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of brick and pitch. As the Persians advanced, they passed under archways blackened with soot, where water had once touched the ceiling during floods. Now it barely reached their knees. Inside the city, the night had become fevered. The festival of Tammuz was nearing its end, the symbolic descent of the god into the underworld. Torches lined the processional way, and the smell of burnt offerings filled the air. Nabonidus's officials feasted in their halls, confident that the siege outside was distant and meaningless. In the temples, priests sang hymns of renewal. The Euphrates, invisible to them, had fallen several feet. The bridges that crossed it now stood over a bed of dark, glistening stone. When the first Persians reached the inner embankment, they found no guards. The lower gates had been left unpatrolled for generations. To the Babylonians, the river itself was a guardian, a sacred boundary no mortal enemy could cross. That faith now betrayed them more completely than any spy or traitor. Gobryas's men climbed the embankment using ropes slick with silt. Their sandals left imprints in the mud. One by one, they rose above the edge and crouched behind the stone balustrades that lined the riverwalk. In the distance, they could see the lights of the royal quarter reflecting off the water's surface. The city lay open before them, vast, brilliant, and unaware. Cyrus's plan relied on synchronization. Once both columns had entered, runners would signal the main force waiting outside the northern walls. If the gates could be taken from within before dawn, the rest of the army would march in unopposed. Timing was everything. The diversion would hold only until the basin filled. After that, the river would return, drowning any soldier still inside. The signal came shortly after the third watch of the night. A polished bronze shield caught the light of a distant fire and flashed twice, the prearranged mark. From the plain, the outer divisions began to move. Inside the city, the Persians advanced through alleys and courtyards, avoiding the main roads. Their orders were to secure the gates and bridges before the alarm spread. Each group moved independently, guided by local defectors who knew the layout of the districts. The sound of their progress was the scrape of sandals and the soft rustle of reeds against armor. The city's noise masked everything. At the northern gate, the defenders had stacked amphorae of oil and grain as a makeshift barricade. They were not prepared for a fight. When the first Persian arrow struck, the guards hesitated, thinking it a drunken brawl from the festival. The confusion lasted seconds. Then the invaders were among them. The gate was seized with minimal resistance. Runners lit small lamps, their flames shielded by metal cups, the signal for Cyrus's main force to enter. By the time the outer troops reached the city, the water level in the Euphrates had fallen nearly 10 feet. The diversion canal was filling rapidly, its embankments groaning under the weight. Engineers worked to reinforce the banks, fearful of collapse. The success of the entire operation depended on the flow holding just long enough. Inside Babylon, the northern and southern columns linked near the central bridge. The meeting was wordless. Soldiers clasped arms, exchanged brief nods, and split again toward their targets: the palace, the armory, and the temple district. Then, for the first time, the illusion of invincibility broke. A watchman on one of the inner towers noticed movement along the riverwalk. He called out, received no answer, and lit a torch. The sudden flare of light revealed dozens of figures moving silently through the mist. He shouted again, this time in alarm. The sound spread like a spark through dry reeds. Horns blared from the citadel. Temple bells rang out. From every quarter of the city came noise, shouts, running feet, the clash of metal. The festival turned instantly into panic. But the Persians were already where they needed to be. At the palace gate, Gobryas's men overwhelmed the sleepy garrison. Ugbaru's force seized the bridge, cutting the city in two. The narrow streets filled with smoke as torches were dropped and fires ignited. The air turned hot and stifling. Through the haze, the banners of Cyrus's army appeared at the northern entrance. The gates swung inward, not outward. The defenders tried to rally, but confusion ruled. Orders contradicted orders. The priests of Marduk fled to the temple, carrying statues and relics. The soldiers guarding the ziggurat found themselves surrounded. For the first time in living memory, the walls of Babylon failed to protect, they trapped. Outside, the Euphrates had nearly finished its betrayal. The water in the basin rose higher by the minute, sending tremors through the earth as sections of the embankment began to collapse. The river would soon return to its course. Inside the city, the Persians had hours, perhaps less, before the flood reclaimed the bed they had used as a road. Cyrus's engineers, waiting at the northern plain, could already hear the distant rumble of water. The diversion was closing itself. The army had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. By dawn, half of Babylon was under Persian control. Fires burned along the docks, reflecting on the shallow water. The rest of the city, vast, ancient, still half asleep, waited for the inevitable. The river was rising again. When dawn came, the sky above Babylon was gray with smoke. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of burning pitch from the riverbanks. From the towers, where guards once looked out over the empire, the view now showed fires along the quays, silhouettes of men moving in the haze, and the slow, dark shimmer of the Euphrates rising again. The invasion had lasted less than a night, yet in that short span, an empire that had stood for centuries was finished. The gates were open, the bridges taken, and the soldiers of Cyrus now occupied every major district. Only the royal quarter still resisted, its defenders barricaded inside the palace complex behind walls of marble and cedar. Cyrus entered the city shortly after sunrise through the northern gate, the very one his men had opened from within. The people who saw him expected a conqueror in armor. Instead, they saw a man in plain robes, flanked by officers but without fanfare. He gave no order for destruction, no demand for surrender. The battle was already over. The rest was administration. For those inside the palace, the realization came slowly. Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, had fled the night before, leaving the defense to his son Belshazzar. In the confusion of the night assault, Belshazzar's guards had fallen, their torches extinguished, and the young prince was struck down near the temple steps. By morning, word spread that the heir was dead and the king in hiding. The chain of command dissolved. In the upper halls, soldiers moved through rooms lined with blue-glazed tiles depicting lions and gods. Gold bowls lay scattered on the floors, the remnants of the previous night's feast. The palace was silent except for the crackling of fires. The Persians advanced with discipline, no looting, no slaughter. Cyrus had ordered that Babylon was to be taken intact. Its wealth, its archives, and its people were to become part of his empire, not victims of it. Outside, the Euphrates had nearly returned to its normal depth. The diversion canal, miles to the north, overflowed and began to crumble. Water surged back into the river's natural course, washing through the streets where hours earlier soldiers had marched. The river that had betrayed Babylon now covered its tracks, erasing the evidence of what had happened. The conquest was so swift, so bloodless, that many Babylonians did not realize they had been conquered until they saw new banners on the towers. Priests emerging from the temples found Persian soldiers already standing guard at the gates. Markets reopened within a day. Life, in its strange resilience, continued. In the temple of Marduk, the high priest was summoned to meet Cyrus. According to later inscriptions, the Persian king addressed him not as a ruler, but as a servant of the gods. Cyrus declared that he had come not to destroy Babylon but to restore it, to return its idols to their shrines and its people to their rituals. He presented himself as the chosen of Marduk, the restorer of divine order. The priests, weary of Nabonidus's heresies, accepted this narrative easily. Cyrus's proclamation, later carved into the famous Cyrus cylinder, announced that he had entered Babylon in peace. It claimed the people rejoiced at his arrival, that he ended forced labor and restored their gods. Whether or not every word was true mattered little. The record of the victors became the truth of history. For the Persians, the capture of Babylon was not just a victory of arms but of strategy and perception. No siege engines, no prolonged battles, no mass graves. Instead, a calculation of geography, faith, and timing, a campaign won by understanding the arrogance of stone and the obedience of water. The city itself remained largely undamaged. Its temples, libraries, and administrative centers continued to function under Persian supervision. The trade routes reopened within weeks. For the first time, an empire had been conquered not by destruction, but by redirection of both rivers and loyalty. The operation at the Euphrates became a model for generations of engineers and strategists. Historians from Herodotus to Xenophon recorded the event in fragments, some embellishing it, others doubting its precision. Yet the core remained. The Persians diverted the river, entered through its bed, and took the city without a full battle. The method was as much an act of engineering as of war. In the aftermath, the people of Babylon adapted with the same pragmatism that had built their empire. They honored Cyrus as liberator rather than conqueror. The temples resumed their sacrifices, the scribes continued their records, and merchants traded as they always had. The world's greatest city had changed rulers, but not rhythm.